Hello, this is the second in a sequence of videos about my theory of developmental stuttering. In my first video, I presented a causal chain for a single moment of stuttering. I propose that stuttering is caused by a misallocation of attention when speaking. Too little attention is directed to the auditory channel. Thereby, the auditory feedback of speech is poorly processed, which elicits invalid error signals in the monitoring system, and they interrupt the flow of speech and cause stuttering. This video is about the second link of the causal chain, about why insufficient attention to auditory feedback or to the auditory channel when speaking affects the processing of auditory feedback and its use in speech control. Is there any evidence for? First, I'll present research results strongly suggesting that attention affects the processing of heard speech. Then I'll report on findings suggesting that this is also true for the processing of the auditory feedback of one's own speech. Finally, I'll briefly discuss the question of how important empirical evidence is of a relationship between attention and auditory feedback processing for my theory of stuttering. Let's get started. In the early 1950s, the British cognitive scientist Colin Cherry conducted his seminal dichotic listening experiments. Participants heard two different spoken messages simultaneously, one in each ear. They were asked to pay attention to just one of the messages and to repeat this message aloud. Later, when asked to describe the contents of the ignored message, they not only couldn't reproduce the contents, they even appeared not to have noticed a change in language from English to German and a change to speech played backward. They only noticed gross physical changes in the stimuli, such as when the unattended speaker switched gender or when the unattended speech was replaced by a 400 Hz pure tone. Neville Moray replicated the experiment in 1959. He found that even if the unattended message consisted of merely a short list of simple words repeated many times, participants couldn't remember any of the words except one, their own name. One's own name is a specific auditory stimulus. Its function is to draw one's attention. When a participant's name occurred in the unattended message, it often elicited an involuntary attentional switch to the unattended message. The fact that we use names and other signal words to get a listener's attention before further talking is an additional indication that attention is necessary for speech perception. The results of dichotic listening studies suggest that attention strongly affects the processing of heard speech. Without attention to the speech signal, only physical features of speech such as volume or pitch seem to be noticed. However, you may object that only the processing of the attended message blocked the processing of the ignored message. More interesting in our context are therefore studies in which not two different speech signals were presented concurrently, but in which participants' attention is directed to the auditory channel in one experimental condition and distracted from in another condition. The first study of this kind was conducted in Germany in 1999 by Jäncke, Mirzazade and Shah. Using fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, participants were scanned while they heard syllables consisting of a stop consonant and the vowel a, such as pa, ta, ga, etc., under three different experimental conditions. In condition 1, the no attention condition, participants were instructed to ignore the stimuli and instead to concentrate on their hands or their feet. In condition 2, the attention condition, participants were instructed to attentively listen to the stimuli. Condition 3, the detect condition, required the detection of a specific target syllable, namely ta, which was presented in 1/3 of the trials in this condition. Participants were asked to briefly lift their left index finger when they heard it. The scans showed significantly different activations in the primary and secondary auditory cortex for the three conditions. The strongest activations were found for the detect condition, followed by the attend condition, and the weakest for the no attention condition. Here you can see figure 2 from the study. It shows the mean percent intensity changes relative to baseline in the secondary auditory cortex, Brodmann area 22, in the left and the right brain hemisphere, for the three conditions no attention, attend, and detect. The results clearly show the association between attention to the speech stimuli and activation in the secondary auditory cortex. The next study I want to present was conducted at the University of Bergen in Norway. It actually doesn't contain a really distracting condition, but it still impressively shows the impact of attention. Hugdahl et al. 2005 investigated the effects on brain activation of attention to different kinds of speech stimuli using event-related fMRI. The stimuli, vowels, pseudo-words, and real words, were randomly presented to the participants during 4 different instructional conditions. One condition was passive listening, without any specific instructions to focus attention. In the other 3 conditions, participants were instructed to focus on either vowels, pseudo-words, or words, and to press a button each time they heard a specific vowel, pseudo-word, or word, respectively. Not the difference between the 3 stimulus types is relevant to our topic, but only the difference between passive and active listening. Here you can see, rendered on an anatomical model, the activations during passive listening in the left and the right brain hemisphere. Small clusters in the middle temporal cortex, Brodmann area 21. And these were the activations during active listening with focus on vowels. Large clusters in temporal cortex bilaterally, greatest in the left superior temporal cortex, Brodmann area 22, and a small cluster in the right inferior frontal cortex, BA 47. These findings again show the impact that attention to speech stimuli has on activation in the secondary auditory cortex. However, as already mentioned, participants' attention was not distracted from the auditory channel in this study. And in the study I reported on before by Jäncke et al. 1999, the instruction to focus on one's hands or feet possibly didn't have a strong distracting effect. A study in which attention was strongly distracted from the auditory channel while speech stimuli were presented was conducted at the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. Sabri et al. 2008 used fMRI and presented words and pseudo-words as speech stimuli and spectrally rotated words as non-speech auditory stimuli. In addition, they included a visual stimulus, namely rapidly changing Japanese characters, and the task for the participants was to press a key each time when 2 identical symbols followed one another. This task, demanding for English native speakers, was chosen to effectively distract participants' attention from the auditory channel. The stimuli were presented in 3 conditions. Condition 1, attend auditory and ignore visual. Condition 2, ignore auditory and attend visual. Condition 3 was a purely visual control condition without auditory stimulation. As already described for the visual stimuli, participants performed the one-back matching task in the attended modality. They pressed a key when an identical stimulus occurred twice in succession. To show the results, I use figures not from the paper but from a poster on which the authors presented their findings at a congress. The figures are like sagittal cuts, and I arranged them so that we can go through the brain, from the far left through the middle to the far right. I'll show the pictures again at a slower pace right away. Therefore, the conditions attend words versus ignore words. That is, words as auditory stimuli and Japanese characters were presented concurrently, and participants either focused on the words and ignored the characters or vice versa. Brain regions with greater activations in the attend auditory than in the ignored auditory condition are rendered in warm colors from yellow to red, and regions with greater activations in the ignore auditory condition are rendered in blue. Now let's start on the far left. What do we see? A large cluster in auditory areas in superior and middle temporal gyrus, and a cluster in inferior and middle frontal gyrus, areas involved in both speech perception and production. Further activations in orbitofrontal cortex and supramarginal gyrus. Going a little deeper, we still see orbitofrontal activations and a large blue cluster in the visual cortex for the ignore auditory attend visual condition. Going even deeper, there are still orbitofrontal activations, and here a large cluster in cingulate gyrus. These large yellow clusters in the medial occipital cortex are not relevant in our context. They likely reflect attentional shifts away from a visual target to peripheral visual locations. Even deeper again, cingulate activations. Now we are in the middle of the brain. Orbitofrontal activations also in the right hemisphere. Again, orbitofrontal activations, and in superior and inferior frontal gyrus. More to the very right, we again see activations in superior frontal gyrus and in angular gyrus and superior temporal sulcus. And finally, in the far right, again a large cluster of activations in auditory areas in superior temporal sulcus and posterior middle temporal gyrus, further activations in angular gyrus, and small clusters in superior and middle frontal gyrus. Note that all these activations were not due to the stimuli alone. They were only present when the participant's attention was directed to the stimuli, but not without attention. The authors conclude that the results support a model in which neutral speech presented in an unattended sensory channel undergoes relatively little processing beyond the early perceptual level. Specifically, processing of phonetic and lexical semantic information appears to be very limited in such circumstances. Neutral speech means here not one's own name or other signal words that are processed and understood even without attention to the auditory channel. So, behavioral studies have shown that subjects couldn't repeat contents of speech they heard while their attention was distracted from the speech signal. On the other hand, neuroimaging studies have shown that activation in brain areas involved in speech processing is strongly reduced without attention to the speech signal. Strictly speaking, we don't know which step of processing didn't work without attention to the speech signal in the behavioral studies. Phonological or lexical processing or retaining the information in memory. We also have little knowledge about the exact relationship between speech processing and the activation or deactivation of brain areas involved in speech processing. But I think we can still take the reported behavioral and neuroimaging studies together as a strong suggestion that heard speech is poorly processed without sufficient attention to the speech signal and with that to the auditory channel. However, there is a further problem to be sure. All the studies are reported on so far were about the effect of attention to an externally generated speech signal. That is, to speech of someone else. Are the findings applicable to the auditory feedback of one's own speech? Does the processing of auditory feedback require attention to auditory feedback? To address this question, let's first take a look at studies that investigated whether auditory feedback is processed in the same brain regions as externally generated speech. Two such studies were published in 1996. Both used positron emission tomography, PET. McGuire, Silbersweig and Frith examined the response to alterations in auditory speech feedback while subjects were reading aloud in two different experimental conditions. In condition 1 they heard their own speech feedback, and in condition 2 they also read aloud but heard the words spoken by someone else. There was no difference in brain activation between the two conditions. The authors conclude that self- and externally generated speech are processed in similar regions of the temporal cortex, and that the self-monitoring of speech involves the temporal cortex bilaterally in areas associated with the processing of speech generated externally. The second PET study was conducted by Price et al., published 1996. They investigated the brain activations during hearing and repeating single words in several conditions, which I don't want to describe here. But a secondary outcome was that, as in the study by McGuire et al., the response of bilateral association areas to participants' voice during speaking was the same as when they were listening to their voice from a pre-recorded tape. In a more recent study using fMRI, Zheng, Munhall and Johnsrude 2010 at the Queen's University in Ontario in Canada investigated the neural basis of auditory motor integration in speaking. To this end, they identified brain regions in which auditory feedback was processed and the overlap of these regions with the network recruited during passive listening to speech sounds. This is from figure 4 in the paper. It shows in yellow the overlap between areas that were active during listening to speech, they are rendered in green, and areas that were activated during speaking when auditory prediction and auditory feedback didn't match, that is, where the self-monitoring of speech takes place. They are rendered in blue, in the left and right brain hemisphere, in different depths, from the outside to more inwards. The authors write, "We've observed enhanced activity in the STG region bilaterally during speech production, when auditory feedback and the predicted auditory consequences of speaking did not match. That is, this region supports the self-monitoring of speech. The same region is sensitive to speech during listening." Further, they write that the network supporting speech perception appears to overlap with the self-monitoring system, in the STG at least, highlighting the intimate link between perception and production. The findings of the last 3 studies reported on suggest that externally generated speech and auditory speech feedback are processed in nearly the same brain regions in superior temporal gyrus. To be sure, this doesn't necessarily mean that both are processed in the same way. So our question remains: does the processing of auditory feedback require attention as the processing of externally generated speech does? Therefore, let's look at some studies that were about whether attention to the auditory feedback of speech affects the use of auditory feedback information in speech control. Tumber, Shah and Jones at the University of Waterloo in Ontario in Canada conducted the following experiment published in 2014. Participants, normal speakers, vocalized the vowel sound ah for some seconds and heard their vocal pitch suddenly shifted downward of 50 cents, that's half a semitone, for 200 milliseconds. The researchers measured the amount of vocal compensation for the pitch shift and recorded the brain responses to the feedback perturbations. There were 2 experimental conditions. In the single task condition, participants only listened to the auditory feedback. In the dual task condition, they listened to the auditory feedback and were concurrently engaged in a visual task. Similar to Sabri et al. 2008, Tumber and colleagues used a rapid serial presentation of letters to distract from the auditory channel, but not with Japanese but with Latin letters. The letters were presented in the single task condition as well, but in the dual task condition participants had to detect two target letters, and the presentation rate of the letters was changed to impose a high, intermediate or low attentional load. The results showed that the vocal compensation for the pitch shifts were greatest in the single task, where attention was focused on auditory feedback only, and smaller in the dual tasks with divided attention. Here you can see the amount of vocal compensation on average if the block of trial started with the single task. The amount of compensation is given in cents. Recall that the shift downward in auditory feedback was of 50 cents. The pink curve is for the single task. The others are for the dual tasks with different attentional loads. The feedback perturbation started here and lasted 200 milliseconds. The vocal compensations were smaller on average if the single task followed the dual task. Maybe participants had then difficulty ignoring the letters, but overall the compensations were still significantly greater in the single task than in the dual tasks. However, there was no difference in brain response. The behavioral part of the study was replicated by Shearer, Tumber and Jones 2016 with similar results. They concluded that attention is required for the speech motor control system to make optimal use of auditory feedback for the regulation and planning of speech motor commands. So we've seen that attention affects the use of auditory feedback, but what about the processing? The first study in which a difference in auditory feedback processing depending on attention was found was done by Liu et al. At the Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, China, published in 2015. The design resembled that of the two studies reported on before, but auditory feedback was shifted up 2 semitones and the visual stimulus was a flashing light. There were 4 conditions: attention to auditory feedback, attention to the visual stimulus, divided attention to both auditory feedback and the visual stimulus, and a control condition without attentional instruction. Here you can see the behavioral results. Again, the amount of vocal compensation in cents. The pitch shift in auditory feedback started here and ended here, and was upward in this study. That's why compensations were downward. The solid curve is for the auditory attention condition in which the compensations were largest again. This is the curve for the attent-visual condition, and the two between are for divided attention and the control condition. And here the brain responses. This is figure 2 in the study. I inverted the colors to get a dark background. The figure shows grand-averaged waveforms of the event-related potential in response to the feedback perturbations over 6 electrodes. As you can see, they all look similar. Here is one example larger. The feedback perturbation started here and ended here. The green curve is for the attention condition, with the smallest N1 amplitude and the largest P2 amplitude. The authors conclude that their findings provide strong evidence for the influence of attention on the mechanisms underlying the auditory-vocal integration in the processing of pitch feedback errors. So this is the first evidence that attention to auditory feedback modulates the processing of auditory feedback. The most recent study at present in May 2025 on the effect of attention on the processing of auditory feedback was conducted at the University of Texas by Zhang et al., published in 2024. Again, participants produced the vowel R for some seconds, and sometimes their auditory feedback was unexpectedly shifted in pitch 1 semitone up or down. The participants were divided into 2 groups. In one group they were instructed to pay attention to their auditory feedback and after each trial to press a green button if they detected a pitch shift upward or downward, or to press a red button to indicate the absence of pitch shifts. The other group completed the same speech task with the same feedback perturbations, but without attentional instruction and without pressing any button. This is figure 2a from the study, showing the average waveforms of the event-related potentials for 22 fronto-central electrodes. Again, I inverted the colors for a dark background. So the green curve is for the attention instruction group and the yellow one for the no instruction group. Here the start and here the end of the feedback perturbation. And again the P2 amplitude was significantly larger in the attentional instruction group than in the no instruction group. Obviously, attention to auditory feedback and the task of detecting changes in pitch modulated auditory feedback processing. Surprisingly, the magnitude of vocal compensations for the pitch shifts was smaller in the attentional instruction group than in the no instruction group. In this figure, the compensations for shifts upward and downward are shown together. Those for upward shifts were flipped over. The green curve is for the attentional instruction group and the yellow one for the no instruction group. In the no instruction group, I think they could unimpeded listen to their auditory feedback. And they probably did listen because there was no distracting stimulus or task, as was in the 3 studies I reported on before. And because the odd-sounding feedback perturbations were likely to attract the participants' attention. By contrast, in the attentional instruction group, they had to make decisions on whether to press the red or the green button and to keep their decision in short-term memory till the end of the trial. So it may be that the instruction given with the aim of increasing participants' attention actually reduced their capacity for the auditory channel or for vocal response. Anyway, Zhang and colleagues conclude that instructions for maintaining attention to auditory feedback may be a useful tool for clinicians working with individuals with speech disorders. They don't mention stuttering, but I think that's a good idea as well for the treatment of developmental stuttering. So it seems that as a rule, increased attention to auditory feedback improves its processing and its use in speech control, and that conversely, reduced attention to auditory speech feedback has the opposite consequences. Given this, my assumption that insufficient attention to auditory speech feedback causes problems in auditory motor integration and ultimately stuttering may not seem implausible or far-fetched. However, the results I reported on don't provide evidence for the correctness of my assumption. But how important is this evidence anyway for my theory of stuttering? Would it be a problem for the validity of my theory if I only proposed that insufficient attention to auditory feedback causes stuttering, without explaining how this may work? It would be no problem because the operational form of my theory, that increased attention to auditory feedback while speaking reduces stuttering, is easily testable, and that's sufficient. It isn't necessary to explain the underlying mechanism, but I think proposing a possible mechanism consistent with the data makes the theory more plausible and convincing and may encourage somebody to test it. Now let's summarize. Dicodic listening studies have shown that heard speech is hardly understood without attention to the speech signal. Neuroimaging results have shown that brain areas involved in speech processing are less activated without attention to presented speech stimuli, suggesting reduced processing of the stimuli. Neuroimaging studies have shown that speech of others and one's own auditory speech feedback are processed in nearly the same brain regions, mainly in superior temporal gyrus. Behavioral studies have shown that attention to auditory speech feedback affects the use of auditory feedback information in speech control. And electroencephalographic results suggest that attention to auditory speech feedback affects its processing. In view of this, it appears plausible and not unlikely that insufficient attention to auditory speech feedback impairs auditory feedback processing, auditory motor integration, and speech fluency. That's all for now. You can find all the references on my website and the document indices also under the video. Thank you for your interest and attention. If you have any questions or objections, please leave a comment.